The music stopped before the bride did. One moment, 200 people were breathing the same warm air, champagne and gardenias, and the particular electricity of a room full of people watching two people choose each other. The next moment, four police officers were standing at the entrance of the ballroom, and no one was saying anything, and the silence had a texture to it, the kind that presses against your ears and makes your pulse visible in your throat. Celestine Wakefield stood in the center of that silence in a white silk gown with a train like still water. She was 31 years old. She had rebuilt bridges. She had survived the kind of rooms that were designed to make her feel like a visitor. She had planned this evening for 18 months, and she had stood beneath a fig tree an hour ago and said the truest words she had ever spoken out loud. And now there were police officers at the door of her wedding reception. She did not cry. She did not run. She did not look to anyone for permission about how to feel. She turned slowly, deliberately, until she found her husband across the room. Everett Callum Rains was already setting down his glass, already moving toward her, already reading the room the way a man reads a room when he has spent his entire life building things in spaces that were never designed with him in mind. He reached her side in 12 steps, took her hand, and then he turned to face the officers, not with anger, not with fear, but with the particular calm of a man who already knows something that the room does not yet know. And what he knew was going to change everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There's a question that lives underneath every story about a room that goes suddenly quiet. Not what happened. That is the surface question, the first thing your mind reaches for. The deeper question is, who decided this room wasn't yours to stand in? Because that is what was really happening inside the Aldenmore on that warm Saturday evening in late September. In a California coastal town where the roads have no streetlights by law, and certain families have held the same parcels of oceanfront property for 4 generations. Someone in that ballroom, someone who had eaten the food, breathed the air, sat beneath the chandeliers, had decided that Celestine Wakefield did not belong at the center of her own evening, had decided that the safest way to express that belief was to pick up a phone and call in the power of the state. What kind of person does that? What do you have to believe about yourself, about who deserves what, about how the world is arranged, to sit at a wedding reception and decide that the bride is the problem? But here's the thing about this story. Here is why it did not end the way that person expected it to end. Here is why, when those 4 officers stood frozen at the entrance of the ballroom, their hesitation was not confusion. It was the very first sign that the ground beneath this confrontation was not what it appeared to be. The building had a secret. Not a dark one, not a buried one. A matter-of-fact, entirely legal, thoroughly documented secret that had been sitting in the Monterey County property records for 4 years, available to anyone who thought to look. But Theron Hartfield had not thought to look. He had looked at Everett Callum Rains, at the midnight blue suit, at the way Everett held himself in a room, at the fig tree ceremony and the Parisian gown and the 7-course fusion menu. And he had seen a version of the evening that his mind had already filed under a category. And in that category, the man at the altar did not own the altar, did not own the floor beneath it, did not own the fig tree in the courtyard, or the original 1941 hardwood, or the chandelier crystal, or the deed with his name at the bottom of it. Theron had looked at Everett and seen a guest. He had not seen the landlord. And now we must ask, who was Celestine Wakefield before this night? What had she built and sacrificed and survived to stand in that gown in that room? What does a woman carry into her own wedding when she has spent a lifetime learning that beauty and excellence and precision are not, on their own, enough protection? What was Everett Callum Rains really holding when he walked those 12 steps across the ballroom to stand beside his wife? And the envelope, the one that Celestine had left at the front desk 2 days before the wedding, sealed, with a specific set of instructions about when it should be retrieved. What was in it, and how did she know to prepare it? How does a woman prepare for a confrontation at her own wedding? The answer to that question tells you everything about who Celestine Wakefield is, and everything about the world she has spent 31 years learning to navigate with her head up and her hands building. We're going to go back to the beginning now. We're going to go back to Fresno and a garage full of broken bicycles and a chemistry teacher who raised her daughter on the belief that excellence was its own armor. We're going to follow Celestine through the rooms that tried to diminish her and the bridges she built anyway. We are going to meet Everett Callum reigns the way you meet a man when you understand that everything about him, the law degree he never mentions, the buildings he quietly acquired while others were looking elsewhere, the community outreach office he renovated out of his own pocket, was preparation for a single evening he did not plan, but was, in every meaningful sense, completely ready for. And we're going to sit with the question that Theron Hartfield will carry out of that ballroom for the rest of his life. What happens when the man you try to have removed from a building is the man who owns it? What happens when the woman you try to diminish has already left the evidence of her dignity at the front desk 2 days in advance because she saw you coming? Stay with us, because this story is just getting started, and every revelation in it is going to feel like a door opening into a room you did not know was there. Fresno in the summer is not subtle about itself. The heat arrives in June like a house guest who has already decided to stay, and it settles into the concrete and the asphalt and the walls of mid-century ranch houses, and it does not lift until October. There is no marine layer to soften it, no coastal breeze to negotiate with. You simply learn to live inside it, or you leave. Celestine Wakefield learned to live inside it. More than that, she learned to love it, the way you love something that has made you strong by requiring strength of you. She grew up in a 2-story house on a tree-lined street in northwest Fresno, in a neighborhood where her father, Roland Wakefield, had planted a jacaranda tree in the front yard the year before she was born. By the time Celestine was 7, that tree was tall enough to make shade. By the time she was 12, it was the landmark neighbors used to give directions. Roland always said the tree was a lesson, that some things require patience you will not be alive to fully collect on, and you plant them anyway, because that is what it means to believe in the future. Roland Wakefield was a civil engineer for the city of Fresno's Department of Public Works. He spent 31 years assessing infrastructure, roads, drainage systems, public buildings, in a department where he was, for most of his career, the only black engineer in his division. He had learned early how to make his competence impossible to overlook, not through loudness, but through thoroughness. He documented everything. He was always 2 steps ahead of the project he was currently on. He trained junior engineers with a generosity that his colleagues sometimes mistook for vulnerability. It was not. It was strategy. He understood that the best protection in a room that was not designed for you was to become indispensable to the room. He taught Celestine this. Not in a speech. Roland Wakefield was not a man of speeches. He taught it through demonstration, through the way he moved through his work, through the particular seriousness with which he sat at the dinner table and listened to her explain the mechanics of whatever she had taken apart and put back together that week. Dorothea Wakefield taught Celestine something different and something equally essential. Dorothea was a high school chemistry teacher. AP Chemistry, 22 years at the same school, the kind of teacher students came back to visit a decade after graduation because she had changed something fundamental in them. She was precise in the way scientists are precise, but she was also warm in a way that precision sometimes kills in people, and she had found a way to hold both. She taught her daughter that emotion and intellect were not opponents, that you could feel everything deeply and still think clearly. That grief and joy and anger were not distractions from the work, they were the reason for it. Celestine was their only child, and she arrived in the world already full of something her parents recognized and immediately moved to protect. Curiosity, the specific, restless, hungry kind that does not wait to be given permission. By age 9, she had read every book in the Fresno County Library System's engineering section for young readers, and had left notes in the margins that the librarian, a long-suffering woman named Ms. Taft, initially found baffling and eventually found so insightful that she saved them. By 12, Celestine had disassembled and reassembled the family's washing machine twice, once to understand it, and once to fix a noise that the repair technician had quoted $300 to address. By 15, she was driving across Fresno with her father on weekends, visiting bridges and overpasses and drainage culverts, Roland explaining load paths and shear forces, while Celestine took notes in a composition book she kept in her backpack. She was not without difficulty. She was not a girl who moved through the world without friction. She was too precise for some teachers, who mistook her corrections for disrespect. She was too self-possessed for some classmates, who mistook her confidence for coldness. She had two close friends, a girl named Waverly, whose family moved to Sacramento when they were 14 and with whom she remained close for years, and a boy named Huxley, who became an architect and who would later, years down the road, refer guests to Celestine's structural engineering firm with a loyalty that suggested he had never forgotten being the first person she explained bridge load distribution to. But she was often alone in the way that people who are building something internal are alone. Not lonely, just deeply occupied. She got into Cal Poly San Luis Obispo on a merit scholarship. She drove herself to the campus in the used Honda her father had helped her buy, with the composition book still in her backpack and the jacaranda tree getting smaller in her rearview mirror. She cried for exactly 12 miles on the 99 North. Then she stopped. She had work to do. At Cal Poly, she discovered that she was not alone in the way she had sometimes been in Fresno. There were other students who were that serious, that driven, that hungry. But she also discovered, in the laboratory, in the seminar, in the field trips to construction sites where their professor would ask them to identify load-bearing elements, that she was often the only person in the room who saw what she saw as quickly as she saw it. She did not always announce this. She had learned from her father that announcing it was not the point. The work was the point. She graduated near the top of her class. She joined a mid-size structural engineering firm in Sacramento. She was exceptional at the job and was told so regularly. She was also regularly assigned to projects that were prestigious enough to build her resume, but were not, in those first few years, the kind of projects that would let her lead. She noticed this. She documented it, the way Roland had taught her, not with bitterness, but with attention. She was patient in the way of a person who knows that patience is not passivity. It is the strategic accumulation of undeniable competence. At 28, she was offered the lead engineering role on the seismic retrofitting project for a network of aging highway bridges along the Central California corridor. It was the most significant infrastructure project of her career to that point. It was also the first project where she had been given a room and told, "This one is yours." She accepted it the way she had been trained to accept things that mattered. Quietly, completely, and with the full force of everything she had spent years preparing. She was 2 years into that project when she was invited to speak at the Coastal Infrastructure Summit in Monterey. It was a Thursday evening when she met Everett Rains. They sat on a panel together at 4 in the afternoon, and by 6 they were at the reception, and by 8 she was at a table by the window with the Pacific visible below, and she was telling him about her father jacaranda tree, and he was listening the way very few people had ever listened to her, not as a performance of listening, but as the real thing. As though what she was saying was the most useful information he had encountered in years, and he did not want to miss a word. She told him, much later, that she knew in that window moment. Not that she would marry him. She was too precise for that kind of romantic certainty. But she knew that he was a person she wanted to keep talking to, that she wanted to understand how he thought, that the world he had built inside himself was interesting enough to spend serious time in. She was right. Everett Callum Rains had spent his life building things that lasted. His father, Winston Rains, was a contractor in Sacramento who had built his business from a single truck and a reputation for showing up exactly when he said he would. Winston was meticulous, unhurried, and entirely without pretension. He built decks and additions, and occasionally full houses. He taught Everett that the difference between a thing that lasts and a thing that doesn't is not usually material or money. It is attention. Whether the person building it actually looks at what they are doing or whether they're already thinking about the next job. His mother, Vivian, argued cases in the Sacramento County Public Defender's Office for 26 years. She was brilliant at reading rooms, at understanding what a jury needed to hear, what a judge's posture was actually communicating, what the prosecution's confidence was built on, and therefore where it could be unmade. She taught Everett that systems, legal, financial, social, were structures. Like Winston's buildings. You could learn how they were constructed, and once you understood the construction, you could navigate it. Everett got his law degree from UC Davis. He never practiced, but he used it every day in the way that understanding the architecture of a system lets you move through it differently than someone who only knows its surface. He spent his 30s making decisions that other people found counterintuitive. He bought commercial real estate in coastal California markets that hadn't gotten warm yet. Carmel by the Sea, Pacific Grove, parts of Santa Cruz that investors were overlooking because they were looking at San Francisco. He was patient in the way that his father was patient. Not from inertia, but from the absolute confidence that attention and timing would do what rushing never could. He purchased the Aldenmore, a 1940s building in downtown Carmel that had been vacant for 2 years and was considered a problem property, and converted it into the most exclusive event venue on the Monterey Peninsula. He did it carefully, over 18 months, with an attention to original details that the city's historical commission praised in writing. He kept the fig tree in the courtyard. He kept the 1941 hardwood floors. He kept the proportions of the original ballroom, which the architect who had built the space in 1941 had understood something about that most people building event spaces today do not. And 3 years before his own wedding, he offered a portion of the Aldenmore's ground floor to the Carmel Police Department's community outreach program at below market rent, funding the renovation himself, because he believed that community investment was not charity, it was infrastructure. He signed a 5-year lease. He sent no press release. He had not put his name on the door. He was the kind of man who planted jacaranda trees. He just didn't use those words. When he proposed to Celestine, he did it on a Tuesday afternoon on the Carmel beach, with no audience, no photographer, no elaborate setup. He had a ring that had belonged to his mother's mother, a structural, unusual thing, platinum and uncut sapphire, nothing like a traditional engagement ring, which is why it was exactly right. He said, "I want to build the rest of my life with you. I would like you to have this, if you'll accept it, because I want you to know I'm not asking for something temporary." She said yes before he finished the second sentence. They planned their wedding with the same seriousness they brought to everything. They chose the Aldenmore, Everett's building, Celestine's favorite room in all of Carmel, because it was theirs, because the fig tree was there, because the 1941 hardwood floors would hold the weight of 200 people and everything those people carried with them. And that felt right for an evening that was also meant to hold weight. Celestine wore her braids and a crown. She walked toward her husband under crystal chandeliers in a building he owned, in a city that had not always welcomed either of them, in a gown the color of everything she had earned. She had left an envelope at the front desk 2 days before. The night manager knew what to do with it. She had done the work. She was ready. The evening moved the way good evenings move, in waves, each one fuller than the last. The ceremony beneath the fig tree had taken 34 minutes. Not because anyone rushed it, but because Honoré Delacombe, the retired judge who had known Everett's father and agreed to officiate as a personal favor wrapped in genuine affection, understood that a ceremony's power lives in its precision. He did not overload the moment. He gave it room. He told the story of a bridge. He invited Everett and Celestine to speak their vows in their own words, which they had written separately and which landed, when read aloud in sequence, like two halves of the same sentence. After, in the ballroom, the 7 courses arrived in a sequence that the Bay Area chef named Idris Asamoah, who had spent 4 months working with Celestine and Everett on the menu, had orchestrated like a score. The first course was a delicate palm nut broth with a Dungeness crab dumpling, translucent and precise, served in ceramic bowls the color of sea glass. The fourth course was a slow-braised short rib with fermented locust bean juice and a compressed pear, something that managed to be both deeply rooted and entirely new. Every course told part of the story of 2 people and where they came from and what they had made together. People said, for years afterward, that it was the best food they had ever eaten at a celebration. What they usually meant was that they could taste the intentionality in it. They could taste the fact that the people being celebrated had thought about every detail, not to impress anyone, but because they believed the details mattered. The jazz arrangement began after the 5th course. The string quartet, whom Celestine had hired because she heard them play at a Carmel Art Walk 2 summers before and had simply not been able to forget the sound they made, had transitioned from the processional repertoire to something warmer, more open, more like water finding its level. The dance floor filled gradually, first the parents, then the old friends, then the people who had been waiting for permission and finally stopped waiting. Celestine danced with her mother. Dorothea Wakefield was 58 years old and moved like a woman who had made peace with her body decades ago and was simply happy to live in it. She held her daughter's hands, and they swayed together in a way that was not choreographed and did not need to be. Celestine, who was precise about almost everything, was not precise about this. She let it be what it was. She pressed her cheek against her mother's hair, and she thought, briefly, about the jacaranda tree on the northwest Fresno Street, and about a composition book full of margin notes, and about the 12 miles of crying on the 99 North, and about everything that had been required to arrive at this particular square foot of 1941 hardwood floor in a gown the color of her own conviction. She was fully inside the moment, which is why she did not see what was happening at the table near the back. Theron Hartfield had been quiet for most of the evening. This was not his natural state. In most rooms, Theron was the organizing sound, the voice that set the tempo of the conversation, the person to whom others deferred as a matter of practiced social habit. But this room was calibrated to a frequency he didn't control, and that had been making him uncomfortable since before the first course arrived. It was not any single thing. It was the aggregate. It was the way the staff moved, attentive, seamless, clearly trained to a high standard, which made it obvious that the person who ran this venue cared about the quality of the experience. It was the food, which was extraordinary in a way that made Theron feel he had less to say than usual about cuisine. It was the ease with which Everett moved through the room during the cocktail hour, the way people came to him rather than the other way around, the way he spoke with the staff, not as someone issuing instructions, but as someone in a mutual understanding with people he clearly respected. These were not the behaviors of a man who was a guest in someone else's space. But Theron had made an assessment earlier in the evening, and he was committed to it, and he was the kind of man who confused commitment to an assessment with the validity of the assessment itself. He leaned toward Desmond Crute around the 7th course and said something low and private. Desmond, who had been watching the evening with a more complicated expression, who had cried at the ceremony and was still not fully certain how to account for it, told Theron to let it go. Theron did not let it go. What he had constructed, in the architecture of his own reasoning, was a story in which this wedding, this beautiful, precise, fully documented, legally sanctioned, privately catered event in a building with a 6-month waiting list, was somehow suspect, unauthorized, an imposition on a space that he felt, in the way that people feel things they have never had to justify because they have never been asked to, should belong to a different kind of occasion. He had not articulated this to himself clearly enough to be embarrassed by it. It lived below the level of articulation. It was structural. He excused himself at 8:43. He walked to the entrance hall of the Aldenmore, stood beneath an original 1940 sconce that Everett's renovation team had rewired to code while preserving its original form, and called 911. He told the dispatcher that there was an unruly gathering at this address, that he was concerned, that he was a frequent patron of the venue, and this did not look like a sanctioned event. The dispatcher logged the call. 2 patrol cars were dispatched. Inside the ballroom, no one knew. Celestine was still dancing with her mother. Everett was at the bar. The quartet was playing something that made 3 separate guests close their eyes without realizing it. 11 minutes later, Officer Darnell Quist and his partner, Officer Reeve McAllister, along with 2 officers from a second car, Officers Felicity, Sorn, and Jerome Padua, walked through the front entrance of the Aldenmore. They came in prepared for the standard range of large gathering disturbance scenarios. They were not prepared for what they actually found. The ballroom had 200 people in full evening attire, a bride in a white silk gown, a groom in midnight blue, crystal chandeliers, gardenias, a jazz quartet between sets, evidence of 7 courses recently consumed with pleasure. Officer Quist stopped moving. His 3 colleagues stopped with him, and in the silence that opened in that gap, Before anyone in the ballroom had registered their arrival, before the quartet noticed, before Celestine looked up, Officer Quist's mind was doing something his face had not yet caught up to. He was running through what he knew about this building, about its owner of record, about the below-market lease his department's community outreach office operated under, in a renovated ground floor space that would have cost 3 times as much anywhere else in Carmel. About the man who had funded that renovation without asking for a plaque or a press mention or anything at all except the annual lease payment, which was set at a number that felt, every time the department processed it, almost too reasonable to be real. He knew who owned this building. He had seen the name on the lease agreement. He was looking at that man right now, standing by the bar 40 feet away in a midnight blue suit. Quist turned to McAllister and said, very quietly, "This is his building." And McAllister said, "Whose?" And Quist said the name. And McAllister was quiet for a moment that stretched like taffy. That was when Celestine looked up. She saw them in the ballroom entrance. For uniforms, the particular stillness of official presence. She stopped dancing, and the moment she stopped, the room began to understand that something had happened. The quartet wound down. The conversations adjacent to the dance floor faltered and paused. 200 people turned, by degrees, toward the entrance where 4 police officers stood without moving. The silence was not chaotic. It was worse than chaos. It was the silence of a room full of people who understood, viscerally and immediately, exactly what a police call to a black wedding reception in California means. What has always risked meaning. The silence of 100 private calculations happening simultaneously, people assessing exits, assessing expressions, assessing the distance between what this evening was and what it might, in the next 60 seconds, become. Celestine stood in the center of that silence in her Parisian gown, and she did not run the calculation anyone else was running. She was running a different one. She turned and found Everett. He was already moving. He crossed the ballroom in 12 steps, steady, deliberate, the pace of a man who has decided how he is going to inhabit this moment before his feet have fully committed to the direction. He reached his wife. He took her hand. He looked at it for 1 second, then looked up at the officers in the doorway. He said, in a voice that carried clearly in the quiet without being raised, "Good evening. Can I help you?" An Officer Quist, standing at the entrance of a building whose deed bore the name of the man who had just spoken, said the words that would break the evening wide open and remake it into something none of the 200 people in that room would ever fully finish thinking about. He said, "Sir, we received a disturbance call. We'll need to verify that this event has been properly authorized for this location." And that's when Celestine realized it wasn't a dream. This was happening. This was real. And everything she had prepared for, everything she had quietly positioned and documented and left in a sealed envelope at the front desk 2 days ago, was about to become necessary. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching." Let's see who's truly following till the end. What happens in a room when 200 people are asked to justify their presence at a celebration that has been months in the making? The answer is not simple. It is not one thing. It spreads through a space the way sound does, at different speeds, reaching different people with different intensities, arriving as different emotional frequencies depending on what each person has already been carrying when they walk through the door. For some of the guests, it was anger, the clean, declarative kind that comes from witnessing something that has no ambiguity to it. An older woman named Genevieve Foss, one of Celestine's former professors, who had driven down from San Luis Obispo for the evening and who had spent 40 years watching gifted black students navigate spaces that were not designed with them in mind, set her champagne glass down on the table with a deliberateness that was its own sentence. For others, it was fear. 2 of Everett's cousins, young men in their mid-20s who had grown up in Sacramento and who knew, with the concrete knowledge of lived experience, that the presence of 4 police officers is not an abstraction, moved closer together without discussing it. For Desmond Crute, who had told Theron to let it go and had been ignored, it was something more tangled, a shame he couldn't fully locate yet, mixed with a desperate wish to separate himself from what had been done. And for Celestine Wakefield, standing in her wedding gown with her husband's hand in hers and 4 officers in the doorway asking about authorization, It was none of those things. It was clarity. This is the thing about Celestine that the people who had only seen her professionally understood in one way, and the people who loved her understood in another, and the people who had tried to diminish her over the years had consistently failed to understand at all. She was not a woman who fragmented under pressure. She was a structural engineer. She spent her professional life identifying the points at which force was applied, modeling how systems responded, determining what held and what gave way. She did not panic at the application of force. She analyzed it. What she was analyzing now was this. For officers had been sent here by a call. A call meant a caller. The caller had made a set of assumptions about this building and about what events it was authorized to host. Those assumptions were demonstrably wrong. The demonstration of their wrongness was not abstract. It was documented, verifiable, and available in real time. But the thing that Celestine understood, with the same precision she brought to bridge load calculations, was that the documentation alone was not going to be enough. Not in the next 60 seconds. Not in a room full of people watching. Not with Theron Hartfield, who had moved from his corner in the entrance hall back toward the ballroom door and was now standing just behind the officers with an expression of carefully maintained composure that did not quite cover what was underneath it. He had not expected the officers to stop. He had expected them to move. And their stillness, Quist's particular, weighted stillness, was something Theron could not yet read. Everett spoke again. His voice was level. He said, "This is a private event. My wife and I were married here this evening. I would be happy to provide whatever documentation you need." Quist said, "Can you confirm your relationship to this property?" There was a breath in the room, a collective, private, audible breath. Everett said, "I own it." 2 words. The room absorbed them. Quist said, "Your name is on the deed of ownership?" Everett said, "It is. I purchased the property 4 years ago. I completed a full historical renovation in 2022. The venue has been operating for 3 years under my management. If you'd like to run the property record, the address is in the county assessor's database." Quist looked at McAllister, a look that was professionally neutral and personally communicating quite a lot. McAllister stepped aside and spoke quietly into his radio. In the room, no one was pretending to do anything other than watching. The jazz quartet had not raised their instruments. The catering staff had paused in the doorways to the kitchen. The 200 guests were a single held breath. Theron Hartfield, still near the doorway, had understood, in the way that intelligent people understand things they do not want to understand, that something had shifted beneath him. The ground was not what he thought, but he had spent 41 years in rooms where his social position insulated him from consequences, and he reached for that insulation now. He stepped forward just slightly and said, to no officer in particular, to the general air of authority in the room, there were concerns about whether this was a legitimate booking. The word legitimate did its work. It landed in the room like a stone in still water, and the ripples moved outward fast. Genevieve Foss stood up from her chair. She did not say anything. She simply stood. 2 other guests stood with her. Then 3 more. Celestine did not move. She watched Theron with the expression of a person who has already read the final chapter and is simply observing how the earlier pages are resolving. She said, and her voice was quiet, clear, and entirely without heat, which was somehow more powerful than anger would have been. "Who placed the call?" The room waited. Theron Hartfield had not expected to be named. He had expected, on some level, to remain ambient, to have acted through the system rather than as himself. He said, after a pause that cost him more than he expected, "I had concerns." Celestine said, "About what?" Another pause. McAllister returned to Quist and said something. Quist's expression, which had been carefully professional throughout, shifted by a fraction. He turned to face Theron directly. He said, "Sir, the property record confirms ownership. This event is on the venue's booking calendar, which we've confirmed via the building management system. The event is fully authorized." Theron said, "There may have been a misunderstanding." Quist said, with the particular tone of a man choosing his words carefully, "There was." And then Quist said something else. He said it quietly, directed at Theron, in a voice that Celestine heard because she was close and that Everett heard because he was closer. Quist said, "The community outreach office. On the ground floor. Your department leases it from Mr. Raines." Theron's face did something complicated. Quist said, "He's our landlord." The silence that followed this was different from the earlier silences. It had a texture of its own, not the tense stillness of a room processing threat, but the electric quiet of a room processing information that has just rearranged what everyone thought they understood about the evening. Celestine looked at her husband. Everett looked at her. She said, very softly for him alone, "Now." He nodded. She turned and walked to the front desk. The night manager, a composed, efficient young woman named Paloma Sutter, had the envelope ready. She had been waiting since Celestine called her on Thursday to confirm the instructions. She held it out without being asked. Celestine took it, walked back across the 1941 hardwood floor, past the officers, past the guests who were watching her move the way people watch someone they have just understood more fully, and she placed the envelope on the table in front of Theron Hartfield. She did not open it. She did not explain it. She placed it there and returned to stand beside her husband. Theron looked at the envelope, at the handwriting on the front, at the fact that it had clearly been sealed before this evening, before any of this, which meant she had known. She had known this was a possibility. She had prepared for it. She had left the documentation at the front desk of a building she already knew her husband owned, in a city where his name was on the community outreach office lease, at a wedding she had planned for 18 months with full knowledge of who would be in the room and what they were capable of. She had done the work. She had been ready. Inside the envelope was a single page. It was a copy of the Aldenmore Certificate of Ownership, Everett's name at the bottom, and below it, in Celestine's handwriting, a line she had written on Thursday afternoon, sitting at the desk in her home office with the Fresno sun in her memory and the composition book still on the shelf behind her. It said, "We knew." Theron Hartfield stood in the ballroom of a building he had tried to call police to, in a city where the groom was the landlord of the police department's own community office, holding a document that a woman had prepared days in advance because she had seen him coming, and he had nothing left to say. The room, which had been holding its breath for what felt like the length of a full construction project, released it all at once. The officers left at 9:17. Before they did, Quist paused at the ballroom entrance, the same entrance he had stood frozen in 30 minutes earlier, and turned back toward the room. The quartet had resumed. The catering staff had reemerged. The 200 guests, who had just witnessed something they would describe for years in the retelling, were finding their way back to themselves. Quist found Everett's eye across the room. He nodded once. It was not a large gesture. It carried a great deal. Everett returned it. After the officers left, after the room had exhaled and the conversations had begun refilling the space with warmth again. Not the same warmth as before, something more complex and more earned. A question moved through the ballroom. Not one that anyone was asking out loud, exactly, but a question that lived in the looks people exchanged, in the way certain guests kept glancing towards Celestine and then toward each other. How did she know? The envelope, the timing, the fact that she had left documentation at the front desk 2 days before a confrontation that hadn't happened yet. The note in her handwriting that said, "We knew," past tense, already past tense, written on a Thursday afternoon before any of Saturday had occurred. She had prepared for this. What does it mean when a woman prepares for a confrontation at her own wedding? It means she has been here before. Not here specifically, not in this ballroom, not at this celebration, but in the shape of this thing, in the specific geometry of a room where someone decides that her presence requires an explanation. She has been in that shape so many times across so many rooms, in engineering offices and field sites and conference rooms and industry summits, that she had developed over years a particular skill. The skill of reading what was in a room before it declared itself. The skill of her mother, who could sense what a class of 16-year-olds needed before they knew they needed it. The skill of her father, who documented everything, who was always 2 steps ahead of the project he was currently on. She had seen Brinley's expression during the cocktail hour, had noted the composition of the back table, had registered the way Theron surveyed the room rather than inhabiting it, the particular body language of a man conducting an assessment rather than attending a celebration. She had felt the shape of it accumulate across the early evening, The way you feel a structural stress before it expresses itself in visible damage. She had called Paloma Sutter on Thursday and said, "I want to leave something at the desk for Saturday, in case it's needed." Paloma had said, "Of course." Celestine had written the note and sealed the envelope and not mentioned it to anyone. Not to her mother, not to Waverly, who had flown in from Sacramento for the weekend, not even to Everett. This was the revelation that moved quietly through the room as the evening reassembled itself. Not the police call that had been the surface drama, the visible event. The revelation beneath it was this. Celestine had known. She had seen it coming with the same precision she brought to seismic load calculations, had documented and prepared with the same methodology she applied to infrastructure assessments, and had walked in her own wedding fully ready for the possibility that someone in the room would try to make her defend her right to be there. And she had not let that readiness diminish a single moment of the evening. She had danced with her mother. She had eaten every course. She had stood beneath the fig tree and said her vows with a fullness that the entire courtyard could feel. She had done all of that while also being in one quiet corner of herself, prepared. When Everett found out, when she told him later that night after the last guest had gone and the building was theirs alone, after the catering staff had finished their quiet cleanup and Paloma had locked the front doors and the fig tree in the courtyard was dark and still, he sat with it for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you been doing this?" Carrying the readiness alongside the rest of it. She thought about it. She said, "My whole life, probably. I didn't always know it was a skill. I thought it was just how you moved through the world when the world was what it is." He said, "It's a skill. It's an extraordinary one." She said, "Your mother gave you the building. Your father built you. And you built all of this." She gestured at the room around them. The 1941 hardwood floors, the chandeliers, the fig tree visible through the courtyard glass. And it was enough. He said, "We built it." She thought she had fully understood what she was marrying. But what she discovered in the quiet of that empty ballroom, in the aftermath of an evening that had tried to take something from her and had instead given her something she hadn't expected, what she discovered was that the man she had chosen had spent the same years she had spent, had been carrying the same readiness alongside the rest of it, had built his preparation into buildings and lease agreements and quietly renovated offices, had planted trees he expected to last. She thought she had lost something in that ballroom, a pristine, uncomplicated wedding evening, untouched by the world's worst habits. But what she actually held in her hands at the end of it was something she had not been able to fully see until it was tested. She thought she had married a good man. She discovered she had married a prepared one. She thought she had walked into a room that was hers by love and by celebration. She discovered she had walked into a room that was hers by every measure a room can be yours, by love, by deed, by law, by preparation, and by the long, patient, thorough, documented work of two people who had each, separately and then together, decided that the world's resistance was not a reason to stop building. That is the twist in this story. Not the police call, not the certificate of ownership, not the fact that Everett was the landlord of the precinct's community office, though that fact, rippling through the room, was undeniable. The twist is the envelope, written on a Thursday, sealed before Saturday, left at the desk of a building by a woman who had decided, long before this evening, that she would not spend her wedding day unprepared. That is who Celestine Wakefield is, and that is who she had been all along. The building was empty by 11, not uncomfortably empty. The kind of empty that a space becomes after it has held something real, when the people have gone home, but the warmth of what happened still lives in the air, in the walls, in the original 1941 hardwood that has held other evenings before and will hold others after. Celestine and Everett sat in the courtyard beneath the fig tree, the same tree that had held their ceremony 4 hours earlier. Someone from the catering team had left 2 glasses of the evening's sparkling water on the small iron table between them without being asked. They sat for a while without talking. The Pacific was below the town, invisible in the dark, but audible if you let yourself listen past the ambient quiet. Celestine had always found that calming, the sound of something vast and moving that did not require anything from you. just the presence of it, just the evidence that the world extends far beyond the room you are currently sitting in. She thought about her father's jacaranda tree, about whether it was in bloom right now, back in Fresno on that Northwest Street. She made a note to ask her mother. She thought about Theron Hartfield, who had left the venue sometime after the officers departed, in a silence that was its own conclusion. She did not feel triumphant about this. That was the thing that surprised her most. In the aftermath, the absence of triumph. What she felt was something quieter and more durable, a kind of settling. The feeling of a structure that has been tested and has confirmed what it was always built to confirm. She thought about Officer Quist and the way he had looked at Everett across the room before leaving. The single nod. She understood what it had cost a man in his position to stand in that doorway, to run the property check in real time, to say the words he said to Theron Hartfield with the quiet precision of a person choosing weight over volume. She thought about Genevieve Foss, who had stood up from her chair without saying a word, because sometimes the most articulate thing a person can do is simply refuse to remain seated. And she thought about Dorothea Wakefield, her mother, who had called her from the car on the drive home, 45 minutes after leaving the venue, which was how long it had taken Dorothea to compose herself enough to use her voice, and said, "You prepared for it." Not a question. Celestine had said, "I learned it from you. You always knew what the room needed before the room did." Dorothea had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father's going to be so proud." Celestine said, "He already is. He's been for years. So have you." She said it knowing it was true, knowing that pride of that particular kind, the quiet, certain, unperformative pride of people who raised a person into something real, does not require an occasion to confirm itself. It is simply there the way a jacaranda tree is there, having been planted by someone who believed in the future. What is the lesson in this story? It is not about justice exactly. Justice implies a system that ultimately sorts things correctly, and systems are human-made structures with a full range of human-made flaws. What happened in that ballroom was not the system working correctly. It was a man and a woman, each of whom had spent decades doing the quiet, documented, unflashy work of understanding the structures around them, whose preparation intersected with an attempt to diminish them in a way that the attempt was never going to survive. That is different from justice. That is something older, something that requires no system to validate it, something that lives in the discipline of showing up fully prepared to every room, including the rooms you hoped you would never need to be prepared for. Celestine Wakefield had not spent her life preparing for confrontation. She had spent her life building bridges, skills, knowledge, relationships, her own internal architecture. The preparation was a byproduct of the building. You cannot do the work she had done without developing, alongside it, the readiness to defend the work. The two things grow together like two branches from the same root. Everett Callum Raines had not bought the Aldenmore as a strategic chess move against a future adversary. He had bought it because he saw value in it, because he believed in Carmel's overlooked corners, because he wanted to restore something original and beautiful. The lease agreement with the police department's community outreach office had not been a calculated positioning. It had been a community investment made by a man who believed that investment was infrastructure. The fact that those decisions, made in good faith years earlier, became the architecture of an evening's resolution. That was not strategy. That was the compounding return on long-term work. There's a word for this. Not luck, not even wisdom exactly. It is something closer to character. The way character, practiced daily and quietly, tends to build structures that hold weight when weight is applied. The fig tree above them moved in a small coastal wind. Celestine leaned her head against Everett's shoulder. He said, "We could go back inside." She said, "In a minute. I want to stay here a little longer." They stayed. And what she understood, sitting under that tree, in that courtyard, in a building that bore her husband's name on its deed, on the evening that had tried to take something from her and had instead confirmed something she already knew, was this. Not every room that attempts to reject you is a room worth grieving. Some of them, by attempting the rejection, reveal exactly what they are made of. And when you are made of something more durable, the revelation is not a wound. It is a measurement. She had measured the room. The room had measured her. She was still standing. And that is when she understood, not every closed door is a loss. Some are the architecture of your own becoming, left behind on the way to the room that was always yours. We want to sit with you in this story for just a moment longer, because it is the kind of story that does not release you cleanly. It follows you a little the way the best ones do. It asks you something on the way out. So let's ask it. What would you have done if you were Celestine, and you felt the shape of that evening assembling itself before it declared itself? Would you have left the envelope? Would you have said something sooner? Would you have been able to hold the celebration and the readiness in the same hands, at the same time, without letting one diminish the other? Or, if you're honest with yourself, is there a version of you that would have let the confrontation become the whole story? That would have allowed one person's worst impulse to eclipse 200 people's love? We ask because the hardest thing in this story is not the police call. The hardest thing is the composure. The discipline of continuing to dance with your mother while also being quietly and completely prepared. That kind of grace is not passive. It is one of the most active things a human being can do. And what about Theron? What do we do with people in our own lives who look at our celebrations and see something that requires policing? What is the right response? Not the satisfying one, not the cinematic one, but the one that actually protects what you've built. Tell us in the comments. We genuinely want to know what you think. This community is full of people who have navigated rooms that were not designed for them, and your perspective belongs in this conversation. And one more question, because this story earned it. Do you believe that preparation is the same as anticipating defeat? Or do you believe, the way Celestine believed, the way Roland Wakefield believed when he planted a jacaranda tree for a daughter not yet born, that preparation is just another word for faith? Faith that the work will matter. Faith that the structure will hold. Faith that you will still be standing when a room has finished deciding what it thinks of you. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something true, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who is in the middle of building something. Someone who is in a room that has not yet decided to let them in. Someone who is composing themselves for an evening they have already, quietly, prepared for. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because we have more stories coming. Stories about people who planted trees they didn't live to sit under. Stories about rooms that tried to close and the people who walked through them anyway. Stories about the specific, undefeatable grace of those who do the work. Our next story is one we have been sitting with for weeks because it undoes you in the most necessary way. Wait until you hear what one decision, made in a single afternoon by a woman who had never considered herself extraordinary, changed 4 lives across 3 decades. We will see you there.